Today on the International Risk Podcast, we're joined by Humphrey Hawksley. He's a foreign correspondent who spent more than 4 decades reporting from wars, political upheaval, and the fault lines of global power. From China and Hong Kong to Sri Lanka, Serbia, and the wider war on terror, he's seen history created from really the best seat in the house. And in today's conversation, we're going to examine his reporting and what it can teach us about the rise of China, the challenges in Russia, the fragility of democracy, and whether the West is losing its direction. Humphrey, welcome to the International Risk Podcast.
Very good to be here, Dominic. There's a huge canvas you gave us for our conversation just now.
I like huge canvases. I think that keeps it interesting for our listeners today. And you travel a lot, but whereabouts in the world are you today, Humphrey?
I am in London. I've just come back from Hong Kong and also just come back from Vietnam, where I was when the Iran war, the latest Iran war started. Fascinating. We can talk about it later, perhaps, looking at the museums of the Vietnamese fighting the Americans, seeing those communist flags still flying high amongst the government buildings, and the way the whole thing was portrayed by America and who won in the end.
I couldn't agree more. For anyone that hasn't been to a good museum lately, you need to go to the Vietnamese Museum in Phnom Penh. And you will really, if you're any sort of a serious person, you'll sit there and just go, hold on, that's not the same war that our families and our side fought in. It is incredibly interesting to read the history. And of course, how the story is told about the French invasion of Vietnam and then the American invasion of Vietnam. It is really, you just sit there for a while and just start to feel a little bit uncomfortable about all the truths you've been told and the truths that the Vietnamese have been told and where the actual facts lie. But no, I couldn't agree more with you, Humphrey. And you've spent 4 decades of reporting from different conflict zones and crises around the world. Can you tell us a little bit about your life as a foreign correspondent and maybe even what you've noticed change throughout your career?
Well, I started, and strangely enough, the idea to become a foreign correspondent started back in 1973 or 4, when a cyclone hit the northern Australian town of Darwin. And it was on Christmas Day, and everybody was drunk and celebrating, and we didn't sleep at all. We were sort of rescuing people from the streets, pulling drunks to safety, keeping our houses up. I woke up in the morning and the whole town was flattened, except in Darwin, the house built on stilts, so all the top bit was flattened, the stilts remained. And I stayed there because, to rebuild, to help people out and everything like that. And the press arrived. And they would interview us, and then you would see them in The Age or the Melbourne Herald or whatever. And I thought, this is quite a nice job. You fly into a disaster, you meet interesting people, and you become a little famous, and you travel, which I love doing anyway. So when I got back to London after doing the sort of Asia trip as a teenager, I got a job as journalist. And I just haven't looked back because it's just, I have a natural curiosity, I think. And, what's this person thinking? What are they doing? Why has this happened? And then, as you say, 40 years on, or probably 50 years on now, however long it is, you look at it, why has this person done this? Why has America gone to war with Iran? And you're sort of using 40 years of experience of untangling what people say against what it actually means, and that thing we call the human condition or human nature, that actually it doesn't change. And love, hatred, loathing, jealousy, all of those things is what drives people to do and create the world that we live in at the moment.
I couldn't agree more. What a fantastic way of explaining that, Humphrey. And as you mentioned at the start, you were recently traveling in Asia. You were just in Hong Kong, in Vietnam. And in your 2020 book called In Asian Waters, you frame the Indo-Pacific as a contest over sea lanes, over influence, and about political will. Now, in March 2026, today, after a brief lull, Taiwan's again reporting a sharp return of Chinese military aircraft and naval activity near the islands. Now, whilst Taipei is trying to rush through a major UM's arms purchases, if we look through the lens of your book and through your experience, Do you think we're seeing a deliberate Chinese strategy of trying to normalize coercion, trying to keep it below the threshold of war? Or do you think we need to start considering if this grey zone pressure is starting to evolve from signaling to actually being real preparation for a blockade or a forced reunification of Taiwan?
I think it's the former, Dominic, and I think that the way the Taiwan story is portrayed in the Western media is completely wrong for a start. And what it does, and let us put to one side the whole Middle East Iran thing at the moment. So what happened after the whole Iraq and everything that sort of day down, and we got bored with the Middle East, is that we pivoted over to Asia and China briefly became the big evil that we had to counter, and Taiwan became the sort of symbolic catalyst of that evil. So here was this democracy thriving in an Asian culture that was being threatened by this big bag authoritarian regime. And that is how it's sort of, and that picture ebbs and flows backwards and forwards. So here in Britain, we constantly get, is China going to invade Taiwan? And the sort of question you asked me. The answer is no, it's not. And the reason it's not right now is two or threefold. Is that firstly, it's watching what's happening with America in Afghanistan and in Iran and Russia and Ukraine and all the rest of it, and it says we really don't want to go down that road. Secondly, if it does invade Taiwan, and if the global focus is on it and sanctions come in, it will be destroying the very markets that make it wealthy, because it sells to Europe and to the US, North America, and all around the world. And this so-called second world or multipolar world hasn't materialized enough. It's not going to make up selling to Nigeria or Brazil what it sells to Europe. So it can't kill those markets. So it's not going to do that. It has constantly said it is going to take Taiwan like the Communist Party took Beijing in 1949. And that is that you surround it, you put these under the radar cordons in, just as you explained, and the people eventually will say, what the hell? That they're not that bad over there in Xiamen. They've got nightclubs. You can have a mistress or whatever it is. Why do we have Nancy Pelosi coming here causing all these problems? But that's a long-term thing. It's going to go on. And then there's another more recent element that's come in, is that Xi Jinping, who's been now in power for 14 years or 15 years or so, he's recently been firing the top military generals. It's a purge that he's been doing to get loyalty. You cannot run an efficient military that hasn't had practice at war and whose generals have just been fired. So it's going to take several years for that command and control structure to get back in again. So I think right now, long answer to your question, the short answer is no, they're not going to invade Taiwan, but they're going to keep up the pressure. And we in the West are going to keep using Taiwan as this sort of symbolic flag of freedom that shows up China for being a nasty authoritarian state.
So for those business leaders and policymakers that want to get it right, what should they be watching next? Is it what happens in the Taiwan Strait? Is it more broadly across the South China Sea? Is it Japan's security posture? Is it supply chains? Is it US alliances across the region? What is going to actually matter? What should they be watching if they want to understand the environment?
To understand the European cultures are held together with a different glue. We apparently share values. We share a sort of Judeo-Christian religion, whatever it is, that there's something there that sort of the democracy of this value that holds us together. There's no common value in Asia. They call it the Indo-Pacific now. It's an American sort of strategic term. But say there are 40, 45 countries in there, depending how you measure it. Only 3 have become fully developed economic democracies. That's Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, which technically isn't even a country. The rest of them, as I've said, have muddled along. So you have a Buddhist, thing next to a Muslim thing, next to a military dictatorship, next to the what a ramshackle democracy that India or Indonesia or the Philippines is, but they're not fully developed democracies. The one thing that binds them together is trade. And trade has always done that. The reason that Indonesia is the world's biggest Muslim country is because Muslim traders went out there and settled there. The same with Malaysia. Trade. So anybody that wants to understand the Indo-Pacific, don't say you need to be human rights, you need democracy, you need trade. And when you have trade, you then need laws in place that makes that trade happen. You need supply chains that stay open. You need security, not just for an electoral cycle, but for 10 or 20 years. And that is really what they need to focus on.
And speaking about what we need to focus on, you've, of course, being a foreign correspondent and nearly all the news at the moment, it's very difficult to read the New York Times, the BBC, CNN, Bloomberg, and not have to read at least 10 articles about Trump and Netanyahu's war in Iran. Now, you've reported exclusively or extensively on the war in terror and across the Middle East. And I think when I compare the current conflict in Iran with other conflicts in the region, one thing that really stands out to me is the lack of even modest attempts at making illegal invasions look legal. Now, George W. Bush Jr. At least made the attempt to make the invasion of Iraq look legal, using terms like preemptive self-defense and weapons of mass destruction. But the Trump-Netanyahu invasion of Iran was clear that it was illegal under international law, yet the world has remained largely silent on this fact. And I wonder if Washington is seen to be weakening the rule of law internationally, but also at home, how much does that damage its ability to actually deter China, to deter Russia, and to deter countries like Iran around democratic values when America is perhaps not upholding the rule of law itself? And I think Reuters did some really good reporting about growing clashes between the Trump administration and the courts, and of course, Trump and Trump allies. So what are you seeing? What's your opinion of the weakening of the rule of law in America and how that impacts us all internationally?
I think it was weakening anyway, mainly because of what the US had been doing and what Trump had been saying about invading Greenland and wanting Canada and all the rest of it. And I think that it took us by surprise, or, the amount of power an American president actually has. There's meant to be a checks and balances, and they seem to have gone completely out of the window at the moment. But I think with this latest war initiated against Iran, the international rule of law is no more. And what will need to happen, it might be a good idea if somebody started doing it now, is that you've got a number of things going on. You've got the Taiwan thing that you mentioned. You've got Iran going on there. You've got Ukraine still going on. We are in a situation where we need to have another big idea, like the United Nations after the Second World War, and look at all these things together and say, okay, we need to fix it. Russia and China need to have a bigger say, and there need to be a rebalancing of the world order, so that those countries that feel that they haven't got a big enough seat at the table get a better seat at the table. You need to fix Ukraine. You need to fix Taiwan. You need to fix Iran. You need to stop this fixation that America has of falsely claiming that nations are getting nuclear weapons and then going to war with them, because it's happened twice now in our lifetime. It's almost as if it's some sort of false thing up there that you say, oh well, he's getting a nuclear weapon, we have a right to bomb them. But they didn't bomb Pakistan, did they? That's an Islamic state that they sanctioned India and Pakistan, but they didn't go to war with them. So they're just going to war with people they don't like. And in the case of Iraq and Iran, Iraq tried to kill George Bush Sr., so that was a sort of personal motivation. And then there's the whole of the Iranian revolution and the hostage situation in the embassy, and there needs to be an equalization of that. And there is this element in the American psychology, which is that they don't like to have a win-win situation, particularly with an enemy. it has to be a win-lose. It has to be Clint Eastwood going into the town and killing the bad guys and making the town a good place. And that is why America in my career, there were two agreements. There was the framework agreement in the mid-1990s that was aimed at preventing North Korea getting a nuclear weapon. That was torn up as the war on terror was being launched for no real reason, just, we're not dealing with these people, we're going to crush them. And then there was the Iran nuclear deal in 2015, 10 years ago, which was a perfectly good deal to make sure it wasn't going to get a nuclear weapon. Why were they torn up? The Republican presidents tore them up, and now North Korea has a nuclear weapon and there's war in Iran.
Well, I wonder, for some of our listeners, they might be wondering if you're advocating for the Trump-created Board of Peace with some of its members. Is that the new idea that you think we need?
Well, actually, I'm not advocating for that, but I think, Dominic, there has to be, if we go back into history, right back to the Westphalia and those various treaties through European history, there's always a war, lots of slaughter and destruction, and then people get together to work out a peace, and that peace might last for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, whatever. Why don't we try and do it before the big war this time? We know it's coming. We can see all the trends. So why don't we just say, okay, let's stop and put it together? Now, there is a precedent for this, because in the 1950s, the Korean War, which was the first hot war of the Cold War, as it were, that had a ceasefire in 1953. And then there were negotiations in Geneva that were going on to stop it. 1954, the French were expelled from Vietnam, and after the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, they just tagged the Vietnam thing onto the Korean peace talks, and they expanded that conference into something. So, you could put Ukraine, Taiwan, and Iran, just put all those issues in a room together and see what comes out of the funnel, not based on any electoral cycle or anything like that. But having given you that example, I'll just push back on my own advocacy here, because part of the Vietnam Agreement in 1954 was that democratic elections would be held in 1956 that would then unify the country. But because Ho Chi Minh, the nationalist leader at the time that was leaning towards the Soviet Union, he would have won a landslide. So what did they do? The Americans canceled the election. So we're not going to have them. And this has happened time and time again. In Iran, 1952, a nationalist leader won the parliamentary elections there. BP thought it was going to lose its oil thing. So the CIA and the MI6 instigated a coup that brought in the Shah. And the Shah went too far, and that brought in these sort of things. So, and I'll just give you to finish the pushback against my own advocacy. It's 2011, the Arab Spring. The Morsi, the president that came to power in Egypt, was part of the Muslim Brotherhood. He didn't last long, and now they have a military dictatorship again. So it's not this flag of democracy or flag of authoritarianism. It's nothing. These are just sort of symbols.
And I will encourage anyone that's not a student of history to really look at some of those things about Iran did have a democracy and we removed it. And that led to the situation we're at today. So we're not always as clean and pure and not always the good guys as we like to think we are. And talking about being the good guys, one thing that I'm really struggling with, Humphrey, and it's easy to throw mud at Donald Trump and politicians, and really any politician, and criticize the decisions they make. But there's been a lot of talk that the US doesn't really have a clear game plan or exit strategy, and Trump's stated purpose of the war in Iran really seems to shift on a day-to-day basis. Now, you could argue that's his deliberate tactic, but it doesn't seem to be the case. It really does to be shooting from the hip. It does appear to be underestimating Iran's capabilities. It appears to be a failure to recognize the damage that it could cause to the Gulf states and the global economy. And now we're seeing this absolutely, this embarrassing situation where Trump is demanding that allies come and help him keep the Strait of Hormuz open, and they're saying no. So, what do you make of that? Is it possible to make sense of the situation where a war could have been launched by two countries with very impressive militaries? Whether you like them, whether you like what they've done, Israel and America have very impressive militaries and very impressive military leaders. How could they launch a war that seems to not have a defined political objective?
Yes, very good question. I don't have an answer to it. I think, like you, I hope hope that they did, but then having done the Iraq War, when actually we think that there was a more mature leadership in, we think that they were more forward thinking and the rest of it. And actually, they weren't. They're not thinking it through. They didn't think it through back then, and there's no evidence that they're thinking it through now. If they believe that the Iranians can rise up, strip out all the institutions, take on over, and produce a democracy, forget it. And I don't know who plants these ideas in their heads.
And I wonder, beyond Iran's retaliation, Israel's military campaign has involved, large scale destruction of civilian infrastructure and entire neighborhoods. There's been mass displacement, raising very serious humanitarian and legal concerns. If we just look at Lebanon alone, over 800,000 people have been displaced by Israeli attacks. And Israel, their defense force there, has threatened to level entire areas of Beirut and southern Lebanon so that they resemble Gaza. Now, of course, as I ask this question to Humphrey, I'm conscious that whenever I ask a question about Israel and a question about this, the International Risk Podcast website gets hacked within about 24 hours. So I'll be interested to see what happens tomorrow, I say with a roll of my eyes. But from your perspective, as someone who's reported on war for decades, how should we be thinking about the question of proportionality and humanitarian consequences? And I'm not defending the Israeli army. I'm not defending Hamas. I'm not defending Hezbollah. But I'm talking about proportionality. I'm talking about humanitarian consequences and the rule of law. But in modern conflicts like this, we're seeing so many of these things occur with seemingly no consequence. Vladimir Putin, for example, has arrest warrants out for him, and yet he was welcomed in America by the US president on red carpet with US military standing at attention to him. How should we be thinking about wars today?
Well, I think it goes back to what we were talking about before. I think there needs to be a new United Nations charter in a way. This word proportionality, like other words like genocide and that, have been taken out to mean something that they're not. Even democracy doesn't really mean democracy anymore. So without getting into the moral pros and cons of what's going on, I think the question is it working? So if Israel goes in and flattens southern Lebanon and displaces millions of people, or if they bomb X number of 7,000 targets, I hear they bombed in Iraq, is it working? I don't think it is, because you have what's called horizontal or asymmetric warfare now, which Iran is doing seemingly quite cleverly, in that it's put a question mark over supply chains, it's put a question mark over oil, it's put a question mark of the whole of global trade, in that it's disrupted it. And what America has done is that it hasn't managed to get rid of the nuclear material. Nobody quite knows where that is or what its effect is, and it's just flattened lots of buildings, and they keep killing these Iranian leaders. But as Trump himself says, well, they're all dead. Yes, because more are coming up. And they can keep killing them, but they won't kill the idea. And I think if we go back to the late 1990s, when we bombed Belgrade, NATO bombed Belgrade, Milosevic, the dictator at the time, was on his last edges. He was just lashing out but the bombing campaign of Belgrade made a cohesive national sort of thing behind him, so that the people that were wanting him out were sort of saying, no, you don't bomb our country. And I imagine a similar thing is going on in Iran at the moment. This is our country. This is an illegal war. No, we don't like this regime that just killed tens of thousands of protesters, but also we don't like another country in bombing it. We have to sort out our own problems.
I think that's very, very valid and a very good lens to put on it. And of course, the question that all journalists, historians, academics love being asked is, if we look ahead, Humphrey, how do you see this war continuing? How do you see it unfolding? What concerns you about the potential paths that the war in the Middle East could take today?
I, I mean, that's a tough one, but I would say that this war will fizzle, um, and Iran will remain under sanctions. The bombing will stop. Israel will go back to its element there, as to what it does. So, you know, during our careers, Dominic, we have seen Lebanon, flattened before. We have seen wars in Gaza, and we've seen this is just notching it up a level. The key issues wouldn't have been resolved. Just coming back from Vietnam and Hong Kong, these places are the lifeblood and essence of the future, because in China and in Asia, everybody's looking towards the future. And if you look at Iran and Russia particularly, their glory is in the past, but China's glory is in its future. And I think that's something we should bear in mind before we start trying to make China an enemy. I think we should work as many ways as possible to work with it rather than work against it.
Now, Humphrey, one of your first postings was actually to cover the civil war in Sri Lanka back in the 80s. And I understand that you were actually expelled after revealing atrocities against civilians. Now, when we look at the Middle East today, we see censorship in Iran. We see British citizens arrested in the UAE for posting photos of damage. We see very strict censoring in Israel. We see the US president verbally attacking journalists that ask him questions that he doesn't like the sound of. Is this just the same censorship that you saw in the 80s, or is it different today? And then a follow on question from that I'd love to hear is, how confident, when you see the younger and the newer journalists coming in today, are you feeling confident that they have the robustness and the drive and the curiosity to work through this censorship? Because there is so much white noise right now. Do you feel that we're able to get the real news, the real stories that we need to be hearing?
If I can answer your first question first, and I'll try not to forget you're the last question first. I'll try not to forget the first one. Since this is visual, I'll stop waving my arms around as sort of expressive things. But I think that journalism as such is in a much more robust situation now because of our technology. The citizen journalists, the clips that, if I go to my Instagram reel feed, I can get the clips of Trump speaking or the Iranian foreign minister speaking and all this sort of thing without having to wade through the. So I think the journalism itself is in good stead, and I think some of the young journalists, the ones that are out there now, the freelancers that started off almost as I started off, tagging on, helping CNN, BBC, or whatever to their careers. I think that they're as gutsy as anybody is gutsy. I think in my day when I was thrown out, the Sri Lankans didn't like me reporting their human rights atrocities on the Tamil Tigers, and that is in a way that the Secretary of War or Defense, or Pete Hesketh, was sort of lambasting journalists for not reporting how he wanted stuff to be reported. So I think that you've got a problem there in that the so-called free speech and the democracies of the West are thinking that they can control the journalists, and in my case, interestingly, is that yes, the Sinhalese government was being absolutely appalling, going into villages and shooting dead lots of Tamils, but because of that atrocity, the Tamils then became the most violent and vicious terrorist group in that they invented the suicide vest. They blew up airplanes. They became a cult that had to be completely crushed. So one of the things I've learned from that is there are no good guys and bad guys.
As we come towards the close, Humphrey, I'd love to talk to you. You've also written some, and as many of our listeners know, I love reading. I'm just I love a good book. If it's a good book by the beach, I'm in heaven. Now you've written some really interesting books, and one of the things that some of our listeners might be interested to know is we're doing a lot of internal debates within the International Wisp podcast about whether we should be having a discussion about Third World War, and there's a lot of credible, non-conspiracy theories, academics, politicians, policy advisors talking about that. And I note that one of your fiction books is about the Third World War, as well as the Arctic. So I wonder if you can tell us a little bit about how you merge what's happening in the world today, and when you've written these books about the Arctic, about Third World War, and any potential links between the fiction and the non-fiction world.
Well, I think the fiction nonfiction is that as a journalist, you feel a little constrained. And as a kid, when I was growing up, what the teachers were lecturing me sort of went in one ear and out the other. But if I got hold of a James Michener's book on Alaska or Leon Uris's Exodus or something, you had me captured, and I learned about the creation of Israel. I did do a book called Third World War. It was during the Iraq surge, actually. It was after Iraq, a lull, and then the Third World War happened. Well, what's interesting there, Dominic, now is that the nations that were involved in that, there's China, Russia, India, UK, US, basically, those nations are characters, and they're not going to change their character. So what we're seeing now is Russia being Russia, Iran being Iran, China being China, America being America. And after the 89, the Berlin Wall came down, the end of history and all of that, America thought everybody wanted to be like Americans. And I had a diplomatic briefing once. It was a bit before that. It was during the Glasnost period in the Philippines. And the American diplomat said, Humphrey, you just got to understand that inside every Filipino, there's an American wanting to get out, and we just got to help them on that path. And this was after the first people power revolution. Ferdinand Marcos was overthrown. His son is now the president. And I covered, I think it was 7 or 8 attempted coups by the military, because they didn't understand what democracy was. This is panoply of institutions that I was talking about. And the thriller series that I've got at the moment actually came out of the Crimea thing 10 years ago, but it's based, the hero comes from the US-Russian border. And this is a border between two antagonistic nuclear powers. And I opened the book and I thought I should go there. And I thought it was like 50 miles of Arctic territory separated them. It's not. There's 2 islands there. And those islands are less than 3 miles apart. And on one of them, you've got a native Alaskan village, no police, no military, nothing to suggest a borderline at all. And on the other side, you've got a Russian military base. And this was one of those political things where the Americans bought Alaska in 1867, but nothing much changed. Everybody kept crossing the border. And during the Cold War comes down what they call the ice curtain. So there are families that were on the Russian side and families on the American side couldn't meet anymore. Interestingly, the Elmendorf-Richardson base in Anchorage, which is where Trump and Putin met, that controls and safeguards that border. And they have Pacific rules of engagement. And during the Cold War, almost a dozen American aircrafts were shot down. Not once did the Americans respond. They absorbed the hit in order not to have it elevated up to a world war.
And when you look around the world, Humphrey, what are the international risks that concern you the most?
I would say, and I've said this before the Iran thing, is the American Congress or the American decision to go to war. And the reason I say that is that the wars of choice that it's taken, mainly the Vietnam, they had the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which was a fabricated incident of an attack by a Vietnamese warship on an American warship. It was fabricated, but that gave congressional right for the U.S. Marines to come ashore at Da Nang, where I was a couple of weeks ago, looking at that whole thing there. So that was fabricated. The Iraq War was fabricated. because there were no weapons of mass destruction. And the intelligence basically said that there weren't either. I mean, I was working with the UN and people around there, people said that it was a bit dodgy. And the reason that Sudan sort of dithered over it was because it would have shown weakness if he had actually said, or given in or something like that. So it was a sort of muscular, chauvinistic thing to do. Iran, quite probably a similar thing. There was, people far greater access to me are saying this, is that there was no imminent threat from it. So I think, and China is not going to start a crisis. We discussed that earlier on. It needs its markets. It needs to build up its military. It's not there yet to do it. Russia has shown that it's going to, only go so far, and it's not going to do any more there. So I think the big risk is the risk of this war particularly being made into a more, or America doing something. And I think this throws this question mark over democracy. I mean, democracy is meant to keep us secure and wealthy and sleep in our beds at night. But the elections of certain leaders in Europe and in America has shown that the way that democracy now operates, and a lot of the systems haven't been modernized, they need to be modernized, is not doing that. It's creating maniacs. And those maniacs do not keep us safe in bed at night. So the whole democratic, so the electoral college in the US, proportional representation, the House of Lords here in Britain, and a raft of things across Europe, which you know more about than I do, it needs to be modernized so that the vote of the people actually creates the people that are going to create the wealth, create the security, and create the standards of living that we vote for.
I couldn't agree more, Humphrey. Thank you very much for articulating that. And thank you very much for coming on the International Risk podcast today.
Thank you, Dominic. It's been a pleasure. You've made me push back against more of my arguments now.
Well, that's good. I think we all need to do that. And I think your reporting, Humphrey, and your analysis really reminds me, and hopefully reminds our listeners, that the world isn't this completely random place. It is volatile, but it definitely is something that's less forgiving of poor judgment and shallow analysis and self-delusion. So I think any sort of pushback we can do on each other is something that we should all be encouraging.
I agree with that. I'm not even going to push back on that.
Well, that was a great conversation with Humphrey Hawksley. Today's podcast was produced and coordinated by Anna Kummelstead. I'm Dominic Bowen, your host. Thanks very much for listening. We'll speak again in the next couple of days.